I say the hungry should have food. I speak for many when I say no one should have 7 homes, while some don't have any. Though I may find myself stranded in some strange place with naught but a vapid stare, I remember the world and I know we are everywhere.
So we're going to open it up to questions, but just before we do that, I just thought I would give a bit of space for Jackie or Roger to respond to each other if they want. If not, we'll move on to questions from the floor. When we do questions from the floor, I'm going to just take 3 at a time, and if you could please keep them relatively brief and concise. The other thing is just a reminder. When you came here, on your seats was a little thing about Solidarity Halifax. If you want to know more about the events, campaigns, or want to get involved with our organization, please fill out the back and put it on the table back there, or to Kyle. Yes, so would you?
I have a minute, Roger? This is not so much in response to Roger, but I'm a little addled and I forgot the really important thing I was supposed to say at the start of my presentation, which is that the views that I've expressed tonight are not necessarily the views of Solidarity Halifax. So what I've expressed is not the point of view of the organization. They're my views, some shared, some not by members of the organization. The other thing, if I could just take a few minutes to add, is I wanted to give you some very, very brief examples of how we've been trying to arrive at understanding this tactical question. Because I think the way you framed it is really important, that it isn't this kind of, I think historically in the left, it was a bit of a sort of morality play rather than a tactical question. And what we began the process of doing, we first started off in Solidarity Halifax thinking, oh dear, we have to take a position on the NDP, or we have to take a position on elections. So what we did instead was to begin a process of generating axioms or points of view that we agreed on that were really descriptive rather than conclusive. And we developed about 60 of these. And I'll just give you some examples of, so we have not arrived at a conclusion about what to do, but some of them, these are some of these 60 statements, for example. One of them is, the NDP's leadership is to the right of its activist membership. It's not rocket science, it's one of the 60. Another one, the NDP is the most progressive of the mainstream political parties. Some people would argue about that some of the time, but I think most people would agree with that most of the time. Another one is the history of the NDP. In Nova Scotia NDP to left movements has not been positive in kind. Another one is, we know that far left parties have been successful in elections outside of North America. We also know there is a history of left politics in Nova Scotia, both electoral and extra-parliamentary. Reforms are not inherently bad. Some reforms challenge the status quo, others do not. An outright rejection of reforms is possible only from a position of privilege. So these are examples of some of the 60 or so ideas that we've tried to generate collectively to prepare the groundwork for understanding what our role should be here in Nova Scotia.
I mean, I hope I've made myself clear. It's difficult for me to comment about or on the issue of what you should do or should not do in Nova Scotia, and I'm acutely aware of how difficult it is to deal with the question of the NDP and how the left should react or not to the NDP, and should you run an election for, against, within the NDP, etc. I'm just trying to put forward a general statement, which I think we should look at a little bit, is that social democratic parties have not been able to answer correctly the question of neoliberal or austerity policies. They have either applied them or failed to answer them in any ways. They have not been able to come up to the challenge and in any way, shape, or form improve the lot of working people anywhere, whether it be the UK, France, Italy, Greece, Portugal, etc. So at one point we have to ask the question, should we put all our energy in building, moving to the left, transforming these parties, or doing things outside? Now, we've been fairly privileged in Quebec because we do not have an NDP to deal with. But I do know through extensive discussion with activists, especially in Europe, that this is not an easy issue. And it was not arrived at easily, and it took tremendous struggles, it took many, many attempts, but also the question of what you do once you set up these new left-wing parties. How do you act towards sections of the social democratic parties or towards potential breakaways from the social democratic party is an extremely acute one. So I'm not attempting to give you any kind of solution or any kind of answer, but just to say that the dilemma that you're facing is a dilemma which is extremely important. I'm just trying to bring some elements which might help or not, in your attempt to seek a way out of this dilemma. Sorry, I'm being a bit verbose. It happens when I get back.
So we'll open up the floor to questions. So please just raise your hand. No questions.
I think it's great that we've settled the issues. We can all go to the tavern.
Okay, well, maybe think on the question. I have one question for just a thought from our discussion, Roger and Jackie, earlier, was you talk about Quebec Solidaire or potential organizations that are similar to that as political expressions of social movements. Now, I'm curious, what does that mean when social movements become dormant or they go through a low period of struggle? What is the role of that type of electoral party in that type of situation? Both of you, I could imagine answering that. Or, and then please put up your hands and I'll put you on the speakers list. So maybe if you want to answer that, and then everyone else can do questions.
I think that's obviously the situation that you're facing. And it's very difficult to deal with, except to say that there are some social movements that are rising and developing. For one, look at Idle No More. So you do have instances, and you do have elements, and you do have sectors which are moving, rising, developing at a point in time. Is that enough to be able to found an organization, develop an anti-capitalist left organization, or enough to want to have a break with reformist or social democratic politics? I don't know. But I think it's worthwhile putting the question forward. It's clear to me that Idle No More did not put forward the question of DP first and foremost in their movement. I don't think it exists anywhere down the line in any of the priorities that they've given. I think they've put mass action and the mobilization of allies, first and foremost in their strategy and tactics. And I think it's interesting to see that one of the most mobilized and radical movement now is pretty much avoiding the question of the NDP and is not even posing tactically that question in the development of the struggle. And I think it says something about how we should treat potentially other social movements. Now, exactly how to treat labor when the NDP has had this long historical relationship with labor, it's much easier for me to deal with in Quebec than to deal with here. I mean, concretely speaking, the NDP does not have the support of any section, any organized section of the Quebec labor movement. Yes, you will get individuals being supported and some individual campaigns being supported, but there's no outright official support by any section of labor. So obviously, when the NDP is not seen as the answer to what people need daily, it's easier to build a new political expression. How to translate that in a case when social movements are dormant, I'd like to hear from you people.
So I have.
If there isn't a question, oh, is there a question?
If you want to.
I just wanted to comment very briefly when you said that, because the first note I had written down in my own thoughts is, when Roger was speaking, was that, you know, the expression of the mass struggles leading to the formation of electoral expressions of that, and what happens when we don't have that, or, excuse me, that's my cell phone. I just kind of let it run out. It'll stop, trust me, it'll stop. I only get one text a day. Only get them at crucial moments. It will stop eventually. I'm really embarrassed. My son put it on and I don't know how to turn it off. The point is that one of the reasons that we're organizing, for example, the People's History Conference is because in Nova Scotia, you know, we really are a colony. And I don't think that's a news bulletin to any of us, that our relationship to the rest of country is one of a colonized, vulnerable, collective structure. You know, it's called a province, but our political and social relationship to the rest of the country is very vulnerable. And so first of all, we have a hard time remembering that there have been important moments of struggle that need to inspire us. But the fact is that I don't think, they're certainly not in my recollection of the history here in Nova Scotia, that the phenomenon of mass movements has not been something that's existed here that has asked for a political expression. And so what happens is those of us who want to make the political expression find ourselves in this delicate situation of almost imposing our political view on the mass movements as weak or expressive as they ever get.
I have Larry, then Leslie.
Yeah, I think mass movements or popular organizations should not forget one very important thing. Despite the ebbs and flows of things, of campaigns we're involved in and the specifics, something needs to be said for being there. And I'll give an example. The end of the 60s, early 70s, the popular movements in South Africa for black liberation seemed to be dead.
Yep.
The ANC was almost wiped out. You know, Nelson Mandela was in prison in Robben Island, and the rest of the ANC was in Harare, not doing much, seemingly not having much influence, but they were both there. Nelson Mandela was acting like a leader in prison, and for better or for worse, the ANC was acting like leaders in Harare. And all of a sudden, in 1976, there was an uprising in Soweto. And that was spontaneous, although I think there were some elements of the ANC involved, but it was very spontaneous. But the organization was there to sort of be almost like a sponge, to grow very, very quickly. And I think that's what we see from Quebec Solidaire. Despite all the ups and downs of the 10 years, let's say since you started with electoral politics and mass politics as well, when the big campaign started almost spontaneously, you were there and you saw the benefits of it just by being there.
Okay, Leslie.
And this can be answered at any time, so I don't want to distract from the discussion about social movements. But Jackie, I think it's really maybe news to a lot of people that Barkley, Rocky Jones did run for the NDP. And you described the lack of attention and support from the left as inappropriate. I was hoping you could sort of maybe describe what the ideal or appropriate situation or response would have been at that time.
Wait, one more. We're going to take one more question in groups of three.
Oh, I did want to talk about, I suppose, mass movements in the sense that in my lifetime, I feel like there's a change in what is a mass movement. Like, you know, if you could put, like in the 70s, you put 500, I was in Vancouver in the 70s, but if you put 500 people in front of the art gallery in Vancouver in the 70s, you had built a mass movement, made front page news, it was, you know, now you put 50,000 people on the street and not getting the news, right? So that's one side of it, like how do we know we've actually sort of got there? Because it seems like there's an ability of capital, the media, educate, the whole system to just ignore us now. Too bad, but as many people on the street as you like. So that's sort of, I just want your comments on that. And the flip side of that is the sort of collectivism, right? Like you feel like you've got a mass movement, my God, 175 people, 1,000 people might have seen something, but it doesn't, what does that mean, right? Like have you actually built something because you have a social media presence or an internet or a web presence or something. So just those two sides. One, honestly, what was a mass movement 30 years ago is not a mass movement anymore because we're ignored unless we're in such huge numbers.
So, I think, so basically, do you want me to?
Do you want me to jump in, begin maybe some answers
Sure, yes,
to the
yes.
questions? Sure. I think the way you put it, being there, is absolutely crucial. And of course, we were helped by the fact that mass movement sort of went through a rebirth in Quebec around 2000 especially, with the People's Summit in Quebec City 2001, around the attempt to expand NAFTA. I mean, that was a signal call. It was a signal call to the mass movement, that was it. Labor organized a demonstration which gathered 70,000 people. Now, compared to the 250,000 people 4 times last year, it seems nothing, but at the time it was, holy, labor is here again. Labor is willing to mobilize. The women's movement had gone through an incredible march to gather up support for an increase in the minimum wage, etc., etc. So there were some things developing, but nowhere as big as what we've seen in the past year. So indeed, this idea of being able to at one point make a break with the existing state of things and begin setting up structures that will be there to take advantage when situation change, I think is a very important point that cannot be overlooked. As to what is a mass movement, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, people ask me, how do you compare the mobilization of the year 2012 in Quebec to what I lived through in the 70s? And I say there's no comparison. I mean, 20,000 people, and we thought this was a tremendous thing. 50,000 people, and we said, oh my God, it's an incredible development, So indeed, in order to get attention of the mass media today, it's extremely difficult. One thing that I would suggest, and it's something I think that can be done, is to work with progressive journalists. I cannot stress how important the ability to work with progressive journalists and work with social media and alternate media is in order to be able to develop this kind of new attempts to develop. I'll give you an example. Once the government brought in their special repressive law, which I mentioned earlier, at the end of May, part of the response was this massive mobilization for another 250,000, 300,000 people in the street. But 2 or 3 days later, a completely spontaneous movement began, which was a pots and pan movement, or the casserole movement, where you had 7 to 8, 10, 12 demonstrations erupting in different working class neighborhoods in Montreal every night pretty much at the same time. Now, no one could have predicted or organized that. I discussed that I was blue in the face with leaders of the Sun movement and said, my God, this was a godsend. This saved, if anything, saved the struggle. That saved the struggle because at one point in time, when you have tens of thousands of people flowing out of their homes night after night in the main city in Quebec, there's no way you can repress that. At one point the government says, look, impossible. I mean, either we bring in martial law or we have to try and find a way out of this crisis. And it came through a call on Facebook. Now, of course, the conditions were set. And those neighborhoods where these demonstrations happen to be neighborhoods where the left has been working for 40 years. But let me ask you, 40 years ago, when I started working in these neighborhoods, if you had told me that at one time, 10, 20, 30 years later, you could have hundreds of thousands of people streaming out of their homes to support a mass demonstration, I would have said, you must be smoking something pretty powerful. And could I have some of it, please? So you're right. But again, this combination of existing media, social media, and all the new ways we can find, I think is one thing that we have to develop and we have to use.
I'd like to answer Leslie's, I'd like to respond to Leslie's question, which is different than answering it. You know, sometimes it's a little tricky to remember 1980. So if anybody else in the room remembers 1980, by all means, speak up. I think it is hard sometimes, those of us who've been involved in anti-capitalist movements, and particularly those of us who are involved in Marxist-Leninist movements, it's hard for us to remember some of our really horrible positions on certain questions. It's actually hard to recall the degree of racism, sexism, and many of the attitudes in our movements. Now, I don't want to say this in a way that sort of vilifies or demonizes the efforts that were very hard-working, that many of us engaged in. But simply to say that part of the left-wing analysis of that era did not include anything but the grand narrative of class. Mm-hmm. And so if it didn't start with class, and it was about race, or it was about colonialism, or it was about gender, or if it was, God help us, about LGBT questions, then it was not part of the class struggle and therefore unimportant. So my position, quite frankly, if I can, you know, come from a rather privileged position of 30 years of hindsight, is that the NDP behaved in a far more progressive manner by inviting or supporting Rocky's candidacy than any of us who were actually handing out leaflets on Goddigan Street for In Struggle at that time on the question of race. Does not mean the NDP's position on every other question was more progressive, but we were ignoring that issue as not really part of the class struggle. And whether for honorable reasons, opportunist reasons, or any possible combination of the above, or just Rocky's incredible leadership, the NDP in 1980 was prepared to put forward the most militant anti-racist activist in the province as a candidate. Yeah, so, and we didn't do that. Nor did we go out there and go door to door in support of him. So I hope that answers that question a little bit.
Okay, I have Holly. Okay.
Yeah, not to swing the conversation, but I was just thinking when we were talking about social movements and electoral politics and how those, I think like the conversation has mostly been around how that influences people who aren't a part of those things. Yeah, I'm wondering how people communicate now, like online, individually at home, like how that affects like our strategy. And like I think that kind of, I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that social movements are even more important now with that to bring people together, like physically together in struggling, when I think that electoral politics might influence people individually in use at home.
Okay. Mo?
I just had like a basic question about were there any changes in the ways like the opposing political forces in Quebec their fight back after the electoral involvement of the social movements, like different ways of fighting back? Because I'm pretty sure they didn't take it easy. Like it might be that kind of did they see it as a threat, as a real threat, or did they have any different strategies to fight that back?
Who are you talking
The
about?
opposing political forces.
The opposing political forces.
Yeah, I was wondering if either Rashi or Jackie could enumerate, or hopefully both of you, enumerate some victories that have come through engagement in electoral politics. You know, be they here, you know, in Quebec or anywhere in Canada or anywhere at all. That just as great examples of when that did work. Because I hear so many of the opposite when it doesn't work. And wondering now what we can hear about you know really solid victory through that kind of engagement, in addition to the ones we've heard.
Okay, who wants to start off?
Yeah, I think you can point to some interesting victories in Latin America. I think this is where, I mean, the fact that Chavez was elected and re-elected 7 times is not something to completely disregard in the face of an ongoing campaign by U.S. imperialists determined to sabotage him, and a coup d'etat, which they tried to engineer with the sectional theory against him. That's interesting. I mean, I've been to Bolivia and I've seen the kind of work that has been done in order to elect and re-elect Morales. With all the criticism that can be made of Morales, I mean, it is a tremendous mobilization of the people, the working class, the people, the most marginalized, poor elements and section of Bolivia, particularly the 70% First Nation component of Bolivia, indigenous component of Bolivia, that has elected and re-elected Morales. So you do have some elements of victories. Can we point to straight out victories in the global north? More complicated. One of the things which I have contended with a lot of activists from the student movement is the fact that the Liberal Party in Quebec was defeated and the 75% increase in tuition fees was defeated is a form of victory. It's not a final victory, it's not a conclusive victory. Of course, the PQ came to power and brought in a cost of living clause with a 3% increase. But 3% is a far cry from 75%. Of course, the principle of tuition fees has been broken, but yet it is a form of victory. Partial victories, tainted victories, but still some form of victories that you can build upon. So I think it's important to approach elections also in a very realistic way. I mean, essentially you're trying to build your forces out of that. You're trying to build the left forces. You're trying to appeal to sections of the population which you do not reach normally, either through your social movements or through your existing organization. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to open up the party to also sections of the people which have never heard or which might be attracted to what you're doing. So there's a gamble in that. How exactly do you put your message? How do you open up the party to these new people who have just been awakened to politics and all that? But I think if you don't do that as a left-wing organization, well, there's something amiss. I mean, if you don't go to the people, if there's one thing I have kept from the Maoist movement is that you have to go to the people. Fundamentally, no matter which way you do it, you have to go to the people, otherwise you're screwed, simply put. So I mean, that's one thing which I think is crucial, and if we don't do that, there's nothing. Now, elections can be a way, but I'm not saying it's the only way. What I think is crucial, and Jackie touched upon that, is obviously we're in a process of completely rebuilding the left and completely rethinking what it is to be left, what it is to be class struggle, what are classes, how things. And I think there's tremendous amount of discussions that are being held on this issue. If you have a chance, do pick up a book called Rebuilding the Left by Martha Harnecker. Martha Harnecker is a Chilean activist who was a very well-known Marxist-Leninist theoretician in the 70s. She wrote some of the key books which had become practically the Bible of Marxist-Leninist activists in Latin America, called Principles of Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Marta has been living in Venezuela for the past 10, 15 years. And she wrote an amazing book in terms of the experience of the Latin American left and how in rebuilding the left you have to move away from commandism, vanguardism, from this incredible dogmatic conception of what is class and what the people constitute, how you have to be able to deal and understand various identities which are not necessarily class-based, but can be, you know, First Nation, indigenous, or even religious, and so on and so forth, and expanding the horizon of what it is to be left in the 21st century with a critical rethinking of what it is we understood by revolution in the 20th century. And she put one interesting question forward, which I don't claim to have answered, but it's the following one. She's saying, what if the way, the form that the Russian Revolution took, and the form and the way that the Chinese Revolution took, is not the way that revolutions will take in the 21st century? Can we insist that all revolutionary movements follow in exactly the same path and exactly the same historical conditions that exist in the 20th century? And then she posed a subsequent question. Why not look at the Latin American experiences with new eyes and say, well, maybe the transition out of the system will take a bit longer than what we thought it would take in the 20th century. And the type of political expression that the left puts forward, i.e. the type of parties that you build today, have to be thought of in a completely different way than what we thought the Bolshevik experience or the Maoist experience was in the 20th century. And I think those are key questions that we have to deal with. There's some people who believe that you cannot begin to build new political parties, new left political parties, until you have exhausted and answered all these questions. My position is that, as they say in Latin America, you have to walk at the same time as you're trying to eat. You have to be able to do two things at the same time. And I think we have to grapple with these questions at the same time as we're setting up new political organizations. And do try to answer the issues that you've answered. How do we deal with racism? How do we deal with white privilege? How do we deal with the question of women's oppression? I mean, we have tried in Quebec Solidaire to institute at all levels a policy of parity, absolute parity in terms of male and female leadership. It's very difficult because when you're in a local chapter and you have to send 6 delegates to your convention and you have to have 3 female delegates on it, it ain't so easy because sometimes there aren't 3 female delegates who are willing to go to the convention. So you go through this long, tortuous process of trying to make sure that as much as possible you try and accomplish that goal of parity. And it's very difficult, sometimes it's very frustrating, but I think it's essential in order to be able to bring in new traditions that will let it work, you know? Same thing in working, I think, with First Nation or Indigenous activists or trying to grapple with some of these new issues that the left has been grappling with for the past 10, 15 years. I mean, our conception of what is class struggle, what is revolutionary struggle, has to expand. It has to go way beyond what we thought it was in the past and open up our organization to new forms of experimentation, new forms of leadership, new forms and new structures. It's very difficult because, I mean, you can't claim to have all these questions answered before you start to do things. But unless you do them, you're not going to find an answer either.
Just a couple of just very small comments. My dear friend Bev Rock gave me a dish towel one time that says everyone wants the revolution, but nobody wants to do the dishes. Someplace we can start. But I certainly can't answer your question because I don't understand enough frankly, about international politics to answer that question. I think there are a couple of very small points. One that's really important is that electoral victories are the instrument by which usually actual reforms do get achieved when they're significant. So probably the most significant reform in Canadian history doesn't need a lot of explanation, and that is the establishment of Medicare, which was a struggle that was waged in the things I've seen on the street and in the ballot box, just as a small example. The other comment I want to make before we, just to be sure this doesn't get lost, is that you know, one of the things about unidimensional or erratic philosophical thinking is this constant yo-yo. So as we reject some of the forms of the historical ways that we behave as Marxists or Marxist-Leninists or the Communist Party or revisionism or Maoism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I think it's also really, really important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And you know, certainly I am critical of many of the experiences and political behaviors that I participated in 30 and 35 years ago. But you know, one of the things I didn't like about the anti-globalization movement, and I don't know where the word globalization came from, because Karl Marx called it imperialism. And he did not mean imperialism in terms of attacking other people's countries. That was the colonial struggle. What he meant was the tendency, as I'm not the economist in the crew, but was for capital to expand globally so that it would begin to consume all of the economic realities internationally. That's probably Marxism 101, or it's the early class. But the point is that there are rich things that we need to understand in, you know, in an entire 20th century of writing from radicals and Marxists, and not just white men, but in the anti-colonial struggle, in the feminist struggles all over the world, there's a rich tradition there that in our desire for applying it in a new way, we not throw that out, because it's really important stuff to help us know something about the reality that we're in. That's all.
I'm just gonna not quite let both of you off the hook with
Aha.
regards to Holly's question, which is the way I sort of read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the analysis there is that we live in sort of an atomized society right now, where we don't have, at least in Nova Scotia, high level of social struggle, social movements. And perhaps, is there a role for electoral politics in that condition to stir the pot, to reach out beyond our day-to-day struggles and our day-to-day organizing, or is that a fantasy? Is it, maybe just if either of you or both of you could maybe touch on that. Is that?
My thought was pretty vague. I find that's like, yeah, there.
Yeah. It does. I mean, you know, as I mentioned in my talk yesterday, I've been involved in 8 election campaigns in the past 10 years. 1, 2, 3, 4 have been provincial election campaigns. 1 was municipal and 3 were by-election. You know, so I've run the gamut of experiences from getting 5.5% and claiming that this was a huge victory, to getting 18% and crying that it was a defeat, to whatever, you know. So it's frustrating, it's hard work, it's difficult, and there's no guarantees that it succeeds. But what it does is that it forces you to look outward. And it's very easy sometimes when we do left organizing to keep looking inward and get totally consumed by your inner struggles and the problems of growing, developing, maintaining your organization. Not that these aren't important, they are, and are crucial. But sometimes by putting them within a wider context of going out there and talking to the people out there and trying to make them understand what you do, it forces you to have a slightly different perspective upon your problems inside. And that's where I think the issue of being there sometimes is so important, because it is through prolonged, agonizing, slow steps that you're able to build a big organization. Nothing falls from the sky, you know? And that's, I think, one of the key issues. So whether it's through electoral means, whether it's through building trade unions, whether it's through building housing groups, anti-racist groups, anti-women oppression groups, whatever, I think all these things are important. But elections, even though we know that there's a turn away from elections, it's still mobilizing 40, 50% of the population. Try and find another period where 40 or 50% of your population out there is open to hearing some kind of a political message. It doesn't exist. That still remains more or less election time. So those are at least one thing that we have to keep in mind. And the possibility of stirring the pot, I think, comes when you're able to pinpoint the key strategic sort of vulnerable point in the political body where you can make a difference even though you're small and not so powerful. Now, I'm not suggesting that this can be found just like that, or that it's easy to find, but those are some of the issues that we can grapple with. And that's where sometimes we're able to move the mass media even if they don't want to move. I mean, we've had election campaigns which we thought were brilliant and completely ignored by the mass media. I mean, Quebec Solidaire's 2007 campaign barely got a mention in the media, you know. 2008 was slightly better. 2012 was completely different because we had an elected member of parliament, you know. And for the first time ever, we were invited to participate in the leaders' debate. I mean, that was an incredible thing. So, and the leaders' debate helped to propel even further Quebec Solidaire. So, you know, how the media deals with you, they ignore you as long as they can, but we have alternate forms of media, and eventually they can't but recognize what you're doing. So that's why I said how you work with the media is an important thing. And that ties in with the question of how do the opposing political forces deal with us. I think we're in a situation now where serious political forces are really intent on destroying Quebec's identity, namely the Parti Québécois and a good part of the nationalist movement around it. And there's two ways in which they're trying to do it. Either by accusing us of essentially playing the federalist game, by weakening the only party which stands to eventually bring about Quebec independence, and therefore betray us as some form of national traitors. This is the most vulgar attack, but it's like done daily. The other one is very subtle, but it is in proposing that there should be a united front of all parties that stand for Quebec independence, and therefore that should be the minimal platform on which Quebec solidaire stands. And therefore that means kowtowing essentially to the Parti Québécois and withdrawing our candidates where of course the Parti Québécois can be elected. So those are two ways in which the opposing forces are trying to deal with that. Of course, the mainstream right-wing forces don't necessarily have to deal with us on such tactical points. I mean, they come on, terrorists, leftists, radicals, minority, this, that. I mean, that's what they use constantly and try and belittle what you do as being completely far-fetched and out there. But I'm saying those are the two strands, the two tactics of attack. And we can deal with the first one. The second one is a difficult one because, it raises really serious questions of how you build your party and how you deal with other political forces, and involves a lot of discussion and debates, particularly in labor movement and others.
Yeah, just a few comments. I think that the first thing is that I think there's a way to never do electoral politics for left-wing, genuine left-wing movements or organizations. And that way is just this highly individualistic, we're just going to run somebody because we have to run somebody, because we have to be on the platform, and we're going to get, 53 votes, and only the most noble people in the world will vote for our candidate. And there are organizations that have continued to do that constantly for a long period of time. I don't think that's the way to do electoral politics. And then there's doing electoral politics by setting up another party. Speaking in Nova Scotia, I don't think we're remotely in a position to do that for tactical reasons or for any number of other reasons at the moment. But politically addressing electoral politics means, in our situation, that we look at the question of who we support and why and where, and how publicly we do that or don't do that, and we make collective decisions about what we're going to do in the next election, not these sort of individual moral decisions, and that we sort of seize nuance so that we're able to say publicly things like, no, we do not support the NDP's behavior in the last 4 years on this, and this crucial question. Or, no, the NDP does not represent our political views. However, in the structure of electoral politics as it currently exists, we urge you, for the 15 minutes that's available to you every 4 years, to actually use that 15 minutes in a way that's not going to cut off our nose to spite our face. Not suggesting that's how we write our material. What's said here stays here, I hope. And please don't quote me on this issue.
We're all looking at you.
Yeah, I don't think that's particularly helpful the way I've said it, but I think you know what I'm saying, right? That we don't have to have positions that are ridiculously narrow and silly, that it is not only possible to walk and talk at the same time or to walk and eat at the same time, it is also possible to speak to two different truths at the same time, because there isn't only one truth. So it's possible to say, this is the reason we urge people, if voting is the only instrument available to us at this time to transform our society, we urge people to continue to vote for the NDP at this time in the electoral struggle. But we don't consider the electoral struggle or the NDP to be what it is, what we believe is needed to create something in a different world. And the last thing I wanted to say is that, there was this little brief attempt in 1990. A group of us organized a little intervention in the municipal election called the Municipal Action Committee, MAC. And we actually organized, if you can imagine this combination, anti-poverty groups, anti-racist organizations or black community groups, and the Ecology Action Center together. These three groups formed a little tiny united front, worked really hard for about 8 or 9 months on trying to just get used to talking to each other, worked on a platform, a simple, very simple platform we could agree to. It took us 9 months, which meant by the time we'd finished that part, it was too late to consider even running candidates. However, we distributed 5,000 pamphlets in the city. We had access to the public media, and because we were so interesting, we were actually participated in the, that kind of, the election results are coming in discourse the night of the election, which was remarkable. It was able to, and that was, there were 20 people who did that. That was all. So considering the question of how to engage in electoral politics isn't just, you either create a political party and you run a candidate in every riding, or you just sit there in the background and, and heave tomatoes at the New Democratic Party because they are not socialist. Surprise, surprise. Sorry, I'll stop there.
I was just going to ask about your relationship. You kind of answered the question earlier when you were talking about the party and that the center kind of left politics that they generally have, and with that nationalist kind of tone involved, and how you, as a party from the left, kind of strike that balance with, I guess, like, because there are a lot of like French left activists I know who are very nationalistic as well, but maybe would appeal more to your brand of left than the party, just because they're more centrist. But how you strike a balance with that community.
Is there any other questions?
Okay, this one's mostly for Roger. I'm curious how the Quebec left in general and Quebec solidaire in particular has responded to the sudden election of 50 plus New Democrat MPs in Quebec.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people were caught by surprise by that.
Mm-hmm. So was the NDP.
To what extent was that a result of left organizing in Quebec? In what sense was it spontaneous? And what has been the response to that sense?
I'll start with the second one and then I'll go to the other one. When I get a chance to speak.
Yes, that's right. And Billy, you were.
I was just thinking here, we were talking about trying to push and pull, suck and blow at the same time of the electoral politics or to reject it totally out of hand. It seems to me that the only thing that anyone who calls themselves left or revolutionary needs to do in a situation like that is to participate at whatever level in a way that raises understanding, not that puts it down. And so therefore, if we were to take a realistic look, let's use an example of the upcoming election with the NDP. I think because of the way that they've acted, both for good and for bad, there's things they did that are helpful, there's things they did are damn harmful, that people are going to be ambivalent on what to do. And I don't think, as revolutionaries, that we can walk up to the public's ear generally and whisper, okay, now's the time to move, Like, it seems to me that we have to be honest right up front at the time that we're trying, if we participate in the politics, that we honestly say where we're coming from and what we expect and what we don't expect, because if we don't, we will just be feeding into the cynicism about the electoral politics, and I think that that's wrong, because all we're doing is sticking a thermometer in the mouth of the people and seeing whether it goes up or down. That's all that elections do anyway. And so, if we can raise people's understanding, that's how the mass movement gets built. That's all I got to say.
Okay,
So
there you go.
I can't respond in Quebec that night. I wanted to add something that's really important, I think, not just in analyzing electoral politics, but in remembering where allies are likely to come. And it's critical and appropriately critical as we can be of parties that do not talk about the necessity for fundamental change or participate in neoliberal policies, et cetera, it's really important to remember that the most likely people to participate in the mass movements and the most likely people to participate in the work that we're interested in doing are probably, if they're involved in electoral politics, located in the NDP. They're not likely that they're located in the Tory party. So I think it's important to remember that there are many honorable people, whether we like their political viewpoints on many important issues. There are many honorable people who are in the political parties trying their best with what limited they know. This is the first time I participated in this large of a group of an anti-capitalist discussion in about 20 years, right? I mean, that's 20 years, so this is really exciting, really exciting that this many people would be here on a warm summer's evening. So we need to remember that those people are there. And then I wasn't going to answer that question. You're going to answer that question. I was just going to put out an advertisement for October 4th and 5th, which is the People's History Conference. Everyone please put it on your calendar. It's going to be a really exciting event to be located at the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center to try to reclaim some of our history. That's the advertisement. Other people can do more later. Go ahead.
Is that location accessible?
Excuse me?
Sorry?
No.
Is that location accessible?
Leslie, we can discuss that with you because we're working on some of the accessibility issues there.
Right?
Yes. Thank you.
And there's pamphlets there, and I'm just going to take a quick moment to, if you've got to go, make sure to fill this out and give it to Kyle, who's standing back there. So this is just to keep in contact with what we're doing and to give you some sort of sense of our organization. So, Roger?
Yeah. On the NDP, very quickly, it was a tremendous, I think, surprise for all involved, including the NDP. I quite often tell the anecdote about Thomas Mulcair being interviewed at 7 p.m. on the day of election. And it was a journalist asked the question, said, Mr. Mulcair, what is the best scenario that you're going to hope for tonight? He says, well, if we have 10 elected MPs, I'll be overjoyed. 59 NDP MPs were elected in Quebec, so for sure Thomas Mulcair did not expect that result. So what brings about that kind of result? I wrote actually a paper that was published in a book called Social Democracy After the Cold War, and it's a chapter called The Left Turn in Quebec. My analysis, and it's not necessarily mine, I think it's shared by a lot of left-wing people in Quebec, is that it was a combination of maybe three factors. One, the intense dislike of the Quebec electorate towards Harper and the Conservatives, intense. And therefore the attempt to find anybody, anything that could defeat Harper, that's one. I think two, the incredible loss of credibility of the Liberal Party in Quebec, whether provincial or federal. By that time it played incredibly strongly at the federal level. And three, the beginning of a thaw in Quebec between two blocs, the Federalist bloc versus the Nationalist bloc, and the beginning of an understanding that this wasn't the end-all and be-all and end-all of politics in Quebec, but you could actually develop a left alternative. And I think Jack Layton played it really well. His intervention, his campaign, his ability to address the electorate in Quebec in French, his pitch towards working families, I think was very good, and I think all this combined in this incredible result that we got in the last federal election. Can it be reproduced? Frankly, I don't think so. I don't think it can be reproduced. I don't think it will be reproduced. One, I think Justin Trudeau's arrival at the head of the Liberal Party is changing the relation somewhat. I think in a lot of the ridings in Quebec where the NDP came in, swing Liberal, so that will change the equation. I don't think the NDP has made the kind of inroads in labor or among social movements that could make a significant change in the next one, etc., etc. So I think this is a one-in-a-lifetime kind of situation where incredible, what the pundits called an electoral wave happened, and you don't know exactly where it will end and who it will carry, and that's what happened in the last federal election. So rapidly, this is my take on it. As far as, and that relates back to the question that you're dealing with, I think that if you don't deal with the Quebec national question head on, in Quebec, you're sunk. I mean, I was in the Workers' Communist Party, spokesperson and leader of that party, and we attempted to craft a position which said, number one is a class struggle, and therefore the national struggle is second, and that we can find a way to answer Quebec's aspiration within a unified Canada. It lasted for a while, but eventually, when the Constitution was repatriated, it just exploded for what it was. Basically, you have a Constitution adopted in Canada, in which Quebec is still not a signatory. What is it, 33 years later on? And I don't think any political party, be it as right-wing as it can in Quebec, would ever dare say that Quebec should sign that Constitution. So there's a problem there that cannot be addressed unless you take on the national question head on and the question of Quebec independence head on. Our gamble was to say that we can develop a left-wing take on the national question, not a right-wing take. A left-wing take that would include worker solidarity, people solidarity, anti-racism, anti-women's oppression, and make that. I think we have done it, partially. I think there's a tremendous audience for that kind of a message, but it's a difficult one, especially when you have the Parti Québécois coming out of a minority government and the next election saying, okay, what do you want? Do you want the Liberals to come back? Or do you give us another chance and this time give us a majority mandate so we can move towards Quebec independence? So it's a difficult issue. I'm not saying that we have the solution on it, but what we're determined is that it has to be a left-wing approach to the national question, not a right-wing nationalist approach. That's as much of an answer as I can give you on that.
Did anyone want to respond to sort of Billy's comment about participating where people are apt to raise understanding in terms of electoral work?
I do. I don't think that's what Billy said.
No.
Yeah.
Sorry, I might have.
Billy, you go ahead and, you know, I mean, it's my comrade, I can take him on.
Yeah, what I was addressing was to always be honest and upfront, so that when, as I inevitably believe, that the NDPs will lose a few votes in this thing, and we'll be picking ourselves up out of the dust, that when that occurs, that we have said what we have to say honestly, so we can respond to the cynicism, because things can go to the right or they can go to the left. And if we don't do it right, if we don't do it correctly, things can just as easily go to the right as they do to the left. That's all I think.
And the reason I reacted so strongly, Dave, is because as a social worker, I've just heard that term used so much to approach people where they're at. And I think it's sometimes a populist statement that, in fact, infantilizes people, right? So, you know, if where somebody's at is, you know, kind of stunned and, you know, not taking life very seriously, you know, you just sort of start where they're at. Or if where there's at is that, well, you know, they're a bit sexist or racist, you know, that's how it goes. And I know that's not how you meant it, but that's why my strong reaction to that statement. I think we need to go where people are located and engage in what Billy is describing, a truth-telling, authentic debate with people about the political world that we're living in. And frankly, given the diet that capitalist ideology dishes out on a daily basis, I don't want to start with where I'm at on a Friday night, which is, you know, watching Mad Men. So please don't start with where I'm at, not on a Friday night. And I promise not to start with where you're at on a Tuesday night. But, you know.
I watch John Stewart, that's better.
We have about 10 minutes, so if anyone wants to sneak a question in, maybe we can do a couple more. Max?
Just me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Go ahead and ask a question.
something happened, and I was with you, Jackie, and when you were talking earlier about the need to really take a nuanced look at what a political situation looks like and then make a really careful strategic decision about how to engage in the election. And I think the program that you're putting forward, putting together these lists of statements about this situation, I think that's really good. But then you just sort of skipped over to say, and you sort of got to a conclusion, which was then, well, we need to be honest and upfront about saying that we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face. Or does it go the other way around? I can always get that idiom mixed up. And I wonder if that skips over that there might actually be, and I'm not saying there is or that I necessarily think this, but I want to bring it up, there might actually be more political utility for the radical left in saying boycott elections. And I just want to throw that out there as like a way to get us talking about this, because I think there is actually a lot of utility in that. Maybe not more utility in our circumstance than supporting the NDP, but I think there is, it's worth entertaining the debate. Does it speak more to people's aspirations and rightly held frustrations with how completely screwed up the system is to actually have a well-organized voice say, you're right, the 60% of you who don't vote are actually right. It's a complete shit show. And you know, forget about it. Let's organize something different. And maybe that's not the right thing to do right now. Maybe it makes more sense to say, here's the reasons why you should, hold your nose and vote for the NDP. But I think it's worth keeping that on the table. Because maybe that would actually help mobilize people in the circumstance of Nova Scotia 2013. Maybe that would be something that would allow people to say, thank God someone finally said what I've been feeling all this time.
I think that's a...
If there's any other questions? No? Okay,
I think that's a really important statement that you made, and I've been having that argument with one particular friend for many, many years who espouses the position exactly as you stated it. I can only speak very personally because of what I do for a living, which is I'm a social worker and I work with very, 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 very marginalized and oppressed people. And for the people I work with, which is ridiculous given the behavior of the Minister of Community Services a couple of weeks ago, but for the people that I work with, the difference between whether EI benefits at the federal level take 8 weeks or take 4 months, or the difference between whether income assistance rates are horrific or very horrific, is profound. It is not profound in my life. I got a good pension, I was a government employee, I bought low, and when I'm dead, my kids can sell high. So my life will actually not be altered by too many of the variations in the next 10 or 15 years. I mean, unless there's, complete economic collapse, as there has been in Greece and in other places. But I'm simply trying to say that the difference between a little bit and some in the lives of the people I work with means I can't say that. It's appealing, and when I talk politics with the people I work with, I usually try to speak what Billy is talking about, which is, I don't think it's going to solve a damn thing other than the difference between horrible and a little less horrible. And one of the reasons that I try to continue to engage in political practice outside of electoral politics is that I cannot look in the face the people that I work with, that I get a salary for working with, unless I'm doing extra parliamentary work. But I also can't look them in the face unless I'm willing to consider that in their lives, the difference between, EI for this many weeks and EI for this many weeks, or this amount of income assistance, or the accessibility to affordable housing is profound. And I don't have the capacity at this time to do anything about that. tomorrow. So that's as well as I can answer that question.
Billy, if you
Yeah, a quick thing that just come to me, that my concern around the way the question gets posed sometimes, it's kind of like the framework that the discussion takes place, is that it makes, and I guess I'm supporting Max's position, it makes it illegitimate and has no validity if you say that you should not participate because of the reasons you say. It seems to me that if we're going to have solidarity in a broader sense, there has to be room in this debate for people who say they will not take part in that discussion. And if we don't frame it that way, then the left, and I've been at the target of that one many times, that you get illegitimized, and therefore if you don't vote, you don't have a say, and you don't have a voice. Well, there's more than one way to have a voice. One of those ways is on the street, as we were talking about. So I would just be concerned that we pose it in a way that allows that voice to be heard. And I find many, many times that voice is not heard. Not only that, it's suppressed on the left.
I'm just going to give Roger the last word. You have about 4 minutes. So,
I have about 4 minutes.
4 minutes.
Yeah. Whoa. Thank you. Thank you very much. I've tried to contribute as best I could to the questions and the debates that you're having. There's one other issue that I want to raise, which is linked somewhat to the question that has been discussed here tonight, is the fact that I think it's important to develop links between the left in Quebec and the left outside Quebec. And I briefly raised that yesterday. I'm going to come back to that today. It's not an easy issue to deal with, and it's not something that we can solve in one or two instances. But with all the work that I've been doing for the past couple of years on building towards a People's Social Forum in Canada, I've seen up to what point establishing bridges between the labor movement, the social movements of Quebec and the rest of the country, working with the new activists and militants coming out of Idle No More and the Aboriginal people struggle, how important the issue of developing some form of united front and united fight back against the right wing, how crucial that question is. Now, I do not mean that this is a key factor in developing this kind of broad-based fight back around the country, but if there were an organized left outside Quebec, it would make things a lot easier in terms of developing this kind of thing. I think we have gotten to a point where we have to be able to see the importance of fighting against that right wing in Ottawa and develop the kind of mass movements that can answer that, but also the kind of vibrant left that is able to work within those mass movements and push the struggle forward. Now, how that can be done, what form that will take, I don't know, and I can't speak about it. But I want to urge you all, if you're able to continue developing the kind of left organization that you're seeking to develop here, you can be sure that we'll do our utmost to continue developing exchanges, dialogue, and collaboration, and basically common forms of struggle against what we live through in Ottawa, and what we have to do in order to overcome the system. So, whatever that you're doing, continue doing it, and I hope my presence here tonight has helped somewhat, and I hope we can continue this very interesting dialogue in the future. Thanks again, and thank you very much.
And we're going to give Jackie just one more minute and to just sum up what she was saying, and also.
Right. Okay. So I don't think I can. I don't really think I can sum up because I'm just so excited because I think the last two statements by Max and Billy were really, really interesting, and so what I've learned tonight is that one of the debates we have to engage in is when and how tactically to understand our relationship to participation in electoral politics, and the other is how to engage and validate all of those people whose anger and cynicism in their direct lives is so profound that they are already ready for something else. And I hadn't thought about it quite that way, and so thank you both for that. Yeah, okay. So this is the advertisement section officially. So the People's History of Nova Scotia Conference that Solidarity is organizing is the night of October 4th and all day October 5th. And our intention is to really name and focus and recall and talk about struggles. The opening night on Friday night is going to be about the history of the civil rights movement in Nova Scotia, and it was intended to be facilitated by George Clark and Rocky Jones. George is going to continue to do that work, and we've been assured there are people in the African Nova Scotian community who agreed to step up. Maybe it will take many people to fill his shoes for that night, but our plan is to continue to do that. On Saturday, there will be 2 sets of panels, including Lynn Jones, who will talk about the occupation on Godigan Street that some people might remember. Pat Kipping is going to talk about aspects of the feminist movement, which is broad and complicated, and so she will not try to represent all aspects. Evan Kuhl is going to talk about important dimensions of the history of Cape Breton labor and other struggles in Cape Breton. Chris Fraser is going to talk about dimensions of the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, transgender movement in Nova Scotia from an historical perspective. And there are going to be other speakers that we anticipate will be talking about the Aboriginal movement, history in Nova Scotia, and the Nova Scotia fishermen's strike, which was a very important event in 1970 that Tony, poor Tony. That Tony Tracy is going to collaborate on pulling together some of the complexity of history. We're also going to have an opportunity for caucusing and discussion, and we've already decided that it's not going to include flip charts, so people are actually welcome just to talk. So we're very, very excited about it. As well, we're going to have the People's Museum at this event, and we are calling for artifacts, so for people to bring out their old T-shirts and buttons and posters and banners and meeting leaflets and agendas and all that stuff sitting around in people's basements and drawers, because we want to reclaim it and honor it, because it's not at the Nova Scotia Museum, and Natasha is here and she's the person who's going to curate that. So please put that on your calendar, and thank you very much.
And thank you for coming, Roger, and thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
I just wanted to make another really quick announcement as well. It happens to be Comrade Pool's birthday today. Standing up at that moment.
I'm actually on my way to the bathroom.
That can wait.
And so a bunch of us are going to head to Charlie's after tonight's session, so if you'd like to join or buy having a drink tonight, I'm sure that would be very welcome.
And don't forget to fill these out and give them to Kyle on your way out. And thanks for coming.
I say the time for the rich it will come. Let me count the ways, victories or hints of the future. Havana, Caracas, Chiapas, Buenos Aires. How many people are wanting and waiting and fighting for their share? They hide in their ivory towers, but we are everywhere.